Imagine this, 11 climbers, from 7 different countries, all standing beneath the death zone of K2. They had conquered every fear, every doubt, every bone-chilling storm, but none of them knew that within just a few hours, K2 would take almost all of them. Some called it the perfect weather window. Others called it a suicide pact with the mountain. By sunrise, August 1st, 2008, the air above the Bottleneck shimmered with danger. A massive ice serac, the size of a building, was hanging right above their only route to the summit. Every climber knew it could collapse at any moment. But after months of preparation, years of dreaming, who would turn back now? Among them, Hugues Dobered, a 61-year-old Frenchman chasing his final great summit. McDonnell, the first Irishman ever to stand on top of K2. Wilco van Rooyen, a veteran Dutch climber leading the Norit expedition. And Cecilie Skog, a Norwegian mountaineer who climbed alongside her husband, Rolf Bay, unaware she'd soon face the most devastating moment of her life. What began as a triumph of courage would soon unravel into one of the darkest, most chaotic tragedies in mountaineering history. 11 climbers would lose their lives in less than 24 hours, and those who survived would never be the same. Because when the ice above K2 finally broke loose, it didn't just take ropes or bodies. It erased the line between bravery and madness. This is not just a story about climbing, it's a story about choices, the kind that define whether you live or become one more name frozen forever on the mountain. Stay with us. This is K2 Stories. It was late July 2008, and base camp at K2 buzzed with energy. Dozens of climbers from around the world had gathered, all waiting for the same thing, a break in the weather. For weeks, brutal winds had slammed the slopes, freezing tents, and scattering gear like confetti down the Godwin-Austen Glacier. But then, on July 31st, the skies cleared. The mountain looked almost peaceful. The towering pyramid of ice and rock stood motionless under a bright blue sky, the Bottleneck glittering like glass. It was the kind of day that makes you believe, just for a moment, that K2 could be tamed. Teams from South Korea, Serbia, Norway, the Netherlands, and France all agreed. Tomorrow, we climb. The plan was risky. Too many teams, too many people. One single fixed rope line up the Bottleneck, a narrow couloir at nearly 8,200 meters, where even a small mistake could mean death. But no one wanted to wait. The weather forecast promised only one good day, one window. At Camp 4, a cluster of tents clung to the shoulder of the mountain like fragile eggshells. Inside, climbers melted snow for water, checked oxygen bottles, and taped up blistered feet. Some prayed. Others just stared silently into the black void below. Cecilie Skog zipped up her husband Rolf's down suit and smiled weakly. He grinned back, calm as ever. Rolf had always been the quiet type, more mountain than man. They had climbed Everest together, and now K2 was their final challenge as a couple. Nearby, McDonnell joked with the Dutch team, trying to shake off the tension. He wasn't just another climber. He was the first Irishman ever to attempt K2. For him, reaching the summit would be history. For his family back home in Limerick, it would be pride, and proof that Jer's lifelong dream was finally real. At 10:00 p.m. that night, headlamps began to flicker on, dozens of small lights in the darkness, a glowing line of determination snaking up into the sky. They clipped into the fixed ropes one by one and began the slow mechanical rhythm of the climb. Step, breathe, clip, step, breathe, clip. The Bottleneck loomed ahead, a wall of sheer ice beneath a hanging glacier. It's called the death zone for a reason. At that altitude, your body is dying faster than you can think. Oxygen levels are so low, your brain begins to misfire. Simple tasks, like tightening a carabiner or tying a knot, become a struggle. Still, they pushed upward. The weather was calm. The stars burned bright. It felt almost too perfect. But high above them, that massive serac, the overhanging block of ice, began to crack. Tiny fissures echoed through the night like distant gunfire. No one heard. By dawn, August 1st, the first climbers reached the summit ridge. It was a surreal sight, a jagged knife of snow and wind, with the world spread endlessly below. The sun rose over China, lighting the clouds gold and crimson. One by one, they stepped onto the summit of K2, exhausted, euphoric, delirious. Some cried, others just stood in silence, unable to believe they'd made it. At 10 a.m., McDonnell radioed down. "We're on top. It's beautiful. We did it." It should have been the greatest moment of their lives, but at 8,611 meters, the summit is not the end. It's only halfway. And as they began to descend, fatigue began to eat away at their strength. Some climbers took too long, others got tangled on the ropes. The line jammed. Progress slowed to a crawl. Then around midday, someone noticed. The fixed ropes below the bottleneck weren't where they were supposed to be. A section was missing. Others were buried under snow or tangled in ice. It was chaos. Without those ropes, descending the bottleneck, a 60-degree chute of ice and rock with a 1,000-meter drop below, was suicide. And yet, they had no choice. The first climbers began to rappel down, cautiously, praying the lines would hold. Then, a deep sound rolled through the air, like thunder inside a cathedral. A moment later, the mountain roared. The serac above the bottleneck broke loose. A wall of ice and snow came crashing down, sweeping away everything in its path: climbers, ropes, gear, dreams. When the whiteout cleared, silence returned. The ropes were gone, the route home, erased. And 11 souls were now stranded in the death zone, trapped on the most dangerous mountain in the world. They had reached the top of K2. But now, K2 would decide who made it down. The sound of the serac collapse echoed across the mountain like the roar of an angry god. For a few seconds, no one could tell what had happened. Then came the silence. A kind of silence so heavy, it pressed on their eardrums. The fixed ropes, their only lifeline down the bottleneck, were gone. Completely swept away. Where once there had been a clear route, there was now only a sheer wall of ice, dusted with snow, steep enough that even a single misplaced crampon would send you plummeting thousands of feet. At over 8,200 meters, turning around wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Oxygen levels were at 1/3 of what the human body needs. Muscles burned, lungs screamed, and above all, their minds began to slip. Panic is fatal on K2. But panic was all that was left. From his position higher up the slope, Wilco van Rooyen, leader of the Dutch Norrit expedition, saw chaos below. Climbers shouted into radios trying to find each other through the blinding haze. No one was sure who was alive, who was missing, or where the line had been torn apart. Somewhere below him, McDonnell and Rolf Bay were still descending. Cecilie Skog, exhausted, freezing, and desperate, waited for her husband to appear through the fog. But Rolf never came. The avalanche had ripped through the narrow passage just minutes after he entered it. Later, survivors would recall seeing a dark figure swept away by the falling ice, a single movement swallowed instantly by white. Cecilia screamed his name into the void, but her voice vanished in the wind. Up above, Wilco tried to take control. He called out to other teams, gathering survivors, trying to assess what could be done. But their radios crackled with static. The mountain swallowed sound like it swallowed light. When he finally reached a group of South Korean climbers huddled beneath a rock outcrop, he realized how bad it was. One man's arm dangled uselessly, crushed. Another's oxygen mask had been torn away. Their guide, Jumek Park, was missing. The survivors decided they would have to descend without ropes, an unthinkable choice, but the only one left. Each step had to be carved into the ice. Each move was a gamble between life and death. Farther down, McDonnell began to hear voices, faint cries for help somewhere below the bottleneck. As the fog lifted for a moment, he saw something few would have believed. A group of 3 stranded climbers, tangled in the remains of the fallen ropes. They weren't part of his team. They were Pakistani high-altitude porters, local men hired to carry loads for the expedition, men who often risked their lives for a fraction of what Western climbers paid for their permits. They were hanging upside down, their harnesses twisted, legs bleeding, trapped in a vertical death trap. Gerd didn't hesitate. He unclipped from his own anchor, crawled toward them, and began cutting away the shredded lines. It was the last anyone would see of him alive. Back at Camp 4, night fell. The radio calls became fewer. Some voices were calm. Others broke into desperate, incoherent fragments. "We're stuck above the bottleneck. We need ropes. Anyone hear me? Please, someone, respond." But no one could move. Those who had survived the icefall were too exhausted to climb. Some had frostbite so severe their fingers were black. A few simply sat down in the snow and never got up again. Meanwhile, Wilco, lost in the darkness, wandered aimlessly through the storm. His goggles had frozen over. He tore them off and felt his eyelashes turn to ice. He had no oxygen left, no map, no sense of direction. Hours passed. Then a shape appeared ahead, a mound of snow with something sticking out of it. It was a body, the first of many. He recognized one of the Serb climbers, frozen upright, still clipped into a broken rope. The man's face was peaceful, eyes half open, staring toward the summit as if he had never stopped climbing. Wilco pressed on. His vision blurred, his thoughts slowed. Every few steps, he fell to his knees, hallucinating. He saw flashes of color, heard voices that weren't there, laughter, songs, memories of home. By some miracle, he stumbled into a tent at Camp 4 around dawn. He collapsed inside, half-conscious, unable to speak. Down the mountain, Cecilie was still waiting, her face frostbitten, her eyes hollow. She refused to leave without Rolf, but as the hours passed, the truth became impossible to deny. Her husband was gone. For the first time, the reality of the situation hit everyone. 11 climbers had vanished, some under the Sirac, others lost to exhaustion or falls. The summit had been conquered, but the price was catastrophic. The mountain, once still and silent, now looked different. The bottleneck was scarred by avalanches, streaked with debris. It was as if K2 itself had devoured them. At base camp, rescuers listened to faint radio signals that faded one by one. There would be no miracles that night. As Wilco later said in an interview, "You don't conquer K2. You survive it, if it lets you." And for the few left alive that day, survival was about to become an even greater test than the climb itself. Because as the sun rose on August 2nd, 2008, they realized the nightmare wasn't over. They were still trapped high above the clouds, with no ropes, no oxygen, and no way down. By dawn on August 2nd, 2008, the summit of K2 looked like the aftermath of a war. Torn ropes hung uselessly from shattered anchors. Pieces of gear, gloves, ice screws, oxygen bottles, lay scattered across the slope, half buried in the snow. The storm clouds that had rolled in overnight were clearing, revealing the true horror of what had happened. The mountain was littered with bodies. The survivors, the few who were still moving, looked more like ghosts than climbers. Faces blackened by frostbite, eyes hollow, movements slow, mechanical, detached from the will to live. They weren't climbing anymore. They were simply trying not to die. Wilco van Rooyen, the Dutch expedition leader, woke up in a daze inside a shredded tent at Camp 4. His face was frozen to his sleeping bag. He could barely see. The thin air burned his lungs. Around him lay silence. No voices, no radio chatter, no sign of the others. Just the low groan of the wind as it swept across the ice. He crawled out of the tent and looked down the mountain. The route was gone. The fixed ropes had been erased by the avalanche, leaving only a sheer slope of glassy ice. At that moment, Wilco realized something horrifying. He was alone. Not far below, Cecilie Skog sat huddled beside her husband's empty pack. She still couldn't bring herself to move. The last time she saw Rolf Bay, he had clipped into the rope at the bottleneck, calm, strong, confident. Now there was nothing left of him but silence. Tears froze instantly on her cheeks as she whispered his name into the wind. Rolf. Somewhere farther down, McDonnell was still missing. Rumors on the radio said he had gone back up to help the trapped porters, the local high-altitude men tangled in the remains of the ropes. Few believed it at first. No one would willingly climb back up into the bottleneck after what had happened. But did. He was last seen by a Korean climber, crawling across the slope toward the hanging bodies. He was cutting ropes, trying to free them. His movements were slow but deliberate. One of the porters was still alive, moaning weakly. Gur managed to pull him onto a small ledge, wrap him in a sleeping pad, and give him his oxygen bottle. Then, another icefall. The second Serac collapse hit the same spot, sweeping away the ledge, the porters, and Gur. It was over in seconds. Back at Camp 4, Wilco knew he had to move. Staying meant dying. The human body can at T survive long above 8,000 meters, the death zone, where cells starve for oxygen and even sleep can mean slipping into a coma. He packed what little gear he had left: one half-frozen glove, a single ice axe, and a radio with a dead battery. Then he began his descent, alone, following the faint outlines of old tracks through the snow. Hours passed. The sun rose high, turning the mountain blinding white. Each step felt like dragging a boulder. His legs trembled, his vision blurred. He had no idea where he was, only that down meant survival. And then as he rounded an ice wall, he saw movement. 2 climbers, Koreans, were struggling a few hundred meters below, their progress painfully slow. Wilco shouted, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. He stumbled toward them, slipping, falling, crawling. When he finally reached them, one man was sitting motionless, his hands frozen into claws. The other barely looked alive. They didn't speak. They just looked at each other. 3 men broken by the same mountain, too weak to help, too stubborn to stop. By evening, Wilco found himself standing on the shoulder of K2, where the slope eased just slightly. He collapsed behind a rock and stared at the sunset bleeding across the sky. It was beautiful. Cruelly beautiful. Below him, the Karakoram stretched endlessly, bathed in red light. He thought about the people who had shared the climb: Jur, Hughes, Rolf, the Koreans, the porters. All gone. Then, for a brief moment, a voice crackled through his radio, faint but real. It was base camp. "Wilco, do you copy?" He tried to respond, but his lips were frozen shut. He forced them open, blood cracking from the corners of his mouth. "Still alive," he rasped. "Descending. No ropes. Send help." The line went dead again. That night, he wandered aimlessly, lost in total darkness. His headlamp battery died. His feet were numb. At times, he thought he saw lights. Small, flickering, human. But they turned out to be reflections of stars on the ice. He fell dozens of times, sliding meters down steep slopes, somehow catching himself each time. At one point, he dozed off in the snow, dreaming of home. When he woke, his hair was frozen solid, his body covered in frost. Meanwhile, down at base camp, rescuers tried desperately to send help upward, but helicopters couldn't reach that altitude. All they could do was watch the mountain and hope that someone, anyone, would appear from the clouds. By morning, only a handful of climbers were still moving. Cecilie, numb with grief, began to descend with another Norwegian. They moved in silence, step by step, their minds empty. She didn't look back. As they descended, the wind picked up again, blowing spindrift across the face of K2. Somewhere high above, the Bottleneck, that cursed narrow passageway, glimmered faintly in the light. It looked calm again, silent, beautiful, like nothing had ever happened. By the time the survivors reached Camp 3, the radios were quiet. 11 climbers were confirmed dead. Their names, once scattered across national flags and expedition logs, were now carved into the ice itself. At base camp, as Wilco finally stumbled into sight days later, frostbitten, blind in one eye, barely alive, the other climbers stood in stunned silence. No cheers, no celebration, just disbelief. He had survived. But K2 had taken everything else. When Wilco van Rooyen finally reached the edge of the glacier, he no longer looked human. His face was swollen, blackened by frostbite. His beard was frozen solid. His eyes, one clouded, one bloodshot, stared ahead, without focus. Each step was a collapse followed by a crawl. He'd been missing for 3 days. 3 days in the death zone, without oxygen, without sleep, without food. By all logic, he should have been dead. At base camp, climbers spotted him through binoculars. Someone shouted, "It's Wilco!" and a rescue team rushed out. They found him staggering in the snow, barely conscious. When they reached him, he muttered only 2 words. "Everyone's gone." They carried him back to camp, wrapped him in blankets and gave him warm fluids. When they took off his boots, the rescuers went silent. His toes were black and hard as stone. The doctor whispered, "He's lucky to be alive." Wilco didn't respond. His mind was still somewhere on the mountain. Down the glacier, another miracle appeared. Cecilie Skog, frostbitten and trembling, guided by a Sherpa and the remnants of another team. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes raw from wind and tears. She'd refused to abandon her husband's backpack, carrying it the entire way down. When she reached base camp, she asked one question, not "Where's food?" or "Am I safe?" She asked, "Did anyone see Rolf?" The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. She sat down in the snow and stared at the mountain. Hours passed. She didn't cry, not yet. Her face was completely still. That night, base camp was quiet. No one celebrated the summit. There were no stories of victory, no pride, only grief, a heavy, unspoken understanding that K2 had taken more than just lives. It had taken faith. One climber wrote in his journal that night, "The mountain is calm again. The wind has stopped. It's as if she's full, satisfied." The news of the tragedy spread fast. By the next morning, word reached Islamabad, then London, New York, Oslo, and Paris. Among the dead, Hugues Dobarede, the 61-year-old Frenchman, who had said before his climb, "If I die, at least it will be in the place I love most." Rolf Bay, the calm, steady Norwegian who believed mountains were meant to be respected, not conquered. McDonnell, the Irishman who went back to save men no one else would. And many others, Koreans, Serbs, porters, whose names never made headlines, but whose courage was no less. Their bodies, most of them, still lie somewhere near the Bottleneck, frozen in time, preserved in eternal ice. In the days that followed, the surviving climbers tried to make sense of it all. Interviews were chaotic, timelines didn't match, details blurred in the thin air of trauma. Some accused others of abandoning their teammates. Some insisted the disaster was caused by disorganization. Too many teams, too little coordination, too much ambition. But one truth stood above all. K2 had given no warning. Even the strongest, the most experienced, the most prepared, all had fallen before the mountain's quiet wrath. Wilco, lying in a medical tent with IV tubes in his arms, whispered to a journalist, "People say we choose to climb. That's wrong. The mountain chooses who stays and who goes." When he was evacuated days later, frostbite claimed most of his toes, but he survived, the only leader to make it down alive. Cecilie stayed behind. For days, she refused to leave base camp. Every morning she walked to the glacier, looking up toward the Bottleneck, hoping for a sign of Rolf. None came. On the final evening before the weather turned, she left a small memorial, his gloves, a photo, and a note tucked into the snow. "We came together. You stayed with the mountain. I'll carry you with me always." Then, with tears frozen on her face, she turned and began the long trek home. Months later, in interviews, Cecilie said she didn't remember much of the descent, only the feeling of complete emptiness. She said, "When you lose someone up there, you don't just lose them. You lose part of yourself, because part of you never comes back." K2 stood silent above her words as if listening. The storm clouds gathered again, covering the summit in mist. The mountain was ready to be alone again. And in that stillness, among the frozen ropes and broken dreams left behind, the legend of the 2008 K2 disaster was sealed, a reminder that on that mountain, there are no victors, only survivors and stories. Weeks later, when the winds calmed and the world's headlines faded, K2 stood silent again, as if nothing had happened. But for those who had survived, silence was no longer peace. It was memory. Back home in Norway, Cecilie Skog could not close her eyes without hearing the low groan of breaking ice. She would wake in the night reaching for Rolf, her hand finding only air. Her doctors called it trauma. She called it the mountain still whispering to her. She later said in an interview, "People ask why we climb. They think it's for glory, for photos, for pride. But the truth is, we climb because we feel most alive where life is closest to death." His family received word that he had likely died helping others. The Pakistani porters no one had remembered at first. To them, Jer's death was not tragedy. It was character. The kind of man he was, giving everything, even when there was nothing left to give. And in the Netherlands, Wilco van Rooyen spent months in hospitals, losing his toes but keeping his will. He would later return to the mountains but not to conquer. He said, "K2 doesn't need to be climbed. It needs to be respected." Yet for many, respect is not enough to explain why they return. It doesn't just test your strength, it tests your soul. Their flags still flutter near base camp. Their bodies remain high above, frozen in time, markers in the snow that remind every new climber what K2 demands. Not courage, not skill, but humility. Because on this mountain, there are no true victories. Only moments when the mountain lets you live. Cecilia once returned to the Karakoram, years later, not to climb, but to stand at the foot of K2 and say goodbye. She placed a single stone on the glacier and whispered, "I came back to thank you for what you took, and for what you left behind." The wind carried her words upward, vanishing into the same silence that took 11 souls. And somewhere high above the Bottleneck, in that thin place between earth and heaven, the mountain waited, as it always has, for the next name it will keep. This was the 2008 K2 tragedy. If this story moved you, subscribe to K2 Stories, where every week we climb back into history's most haunting moments and listen to the mountains that never forget.